So it's not exactly just another strike in a war we've already been tracking for 3 years. It's actually the moment two completely separate conflicts started touching each other on the same stretch of water. And once you see how that happened, you won't be able to unsee it in everything that follows in this region. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this. On a recent strike, Ukraine hit a vessel believed to be a 90-meter cargo ship called the Anna, along with a Russian patrol vessel operating on the Caspian Sea. That ship was suspected of carrying weapons and supplies from Russia into Iran. Understand what makes this strike different from the roughly 196 other vessels Ukraine has hit since this war began. 126 in the Sea of Azov, 70 up in the Black Sea. Those were all part of the Russia-Ukraine conflict directly. This one wasn't. This one was Ukraine reaching into a completely different body of water to hit a supply line feeding a completely different conflict, the one involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. Before we go further, if you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe, and hit the bell so you're alerted when new episodes come out. This channel exists to catch these connections before anyone else is even asking the question. And here's something I want you to think about while we get into this. Where are you watching this from? Do you think of the Russia-Ukraine war and the Iran conflict as two separate stories? Or have you already noticed them starting to blend together? Let me know in the comments, because I think most people are still processing these as unrelated headlines. Now, let's break this down properly, because you need the geography first to understand why this strike is significant. The Caspian Sea is landlocked. It has no direct connection to any ocean, no open water route in or out. It's bordered by Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan. For a very long time, that isolation made it something of a blind spot in global maritime conflict coverage, because nobody expected naval-style strikes to happen there. It wasn't a choke point anyone was watching the way we watch the Strait of Hormuz or the Suez Canal. Understand that changes the moment a vessel gets hit there in connection with an active war. Let's take a look at what that route on the Caspian actually represents. Russia has used Caspian Sea shipping lanes as a supply corridor toward Iran for materiel transfer. Weapons, military stores, and equipment moving by water rather than overland. Likely because water routes are harder to monitor via satellite imagery compared to fixed rail lines or highway convoys, and because a cargo vessel blends in with ordinary commercial traffic in a way a military convoy never could. That's the mechanism here, using civilian-style shipping as cover for a military supply chain between two allied states. Now here's where it gets interesting, and here's why I think this single strike is more important than the headlines are giving it credit for. Ukraine had never, to our knowledge, conducted a strike this far from its own coastline, in a body of water with zero direct connection to the Black Sea or the Sea of Azov. Understand what that tells us about capability. Ukraine's naval strike program has largely been built around long-range sea drones and precision targeting close to its own coastline and the wider Black Sea basin. Reaching into the Caspian Sea, an entirely separate, landlocked body of water on the other side of the Caucasus suggests either a significant extension of operational reach, coordination with an allied intelligence or targeting partner with visibility into that region, or both. Let's talk about the second thing this tells us, which is arguably more important than the technical capability question. It tells us Ukraine has made a strategic decision to go after Russia's external relationships, not just Russia's domestic warfighting capacity. Striking a supply route feeding materiel into Iran isn't about weakening Russia's position in Ukraine directly. It's about disrupting the broader network of support Russia has built with partners like Iran, North Korea, and others over the course of this war. Understand that this is a fundamentally different kind of target than a shuttle tanker in the Sea of Azov or a berthed vessel in a Ukrainian port. This is Ukraine reaching out and touching Russia's foreign policy machinery, not just its battlefield logistics. Now let's connect this to the broader Iran conflict, because that's really the second half of why this matters. The United States, Israel, and Iran have been locked in escalating tension, and one of the recurring themes throughout that conflict has been concern over Iran's supply lines, where Iran gets materiel, how it moves things in and out of the country, and who its enablers are. Russia has long been suspected of providing various forms of military and technical support to Iran, And a lot of that suspicion has centered on exactly this kind of route. Caspian Sea shipping, moving quietly, away from the more heavily monitored maritime choke points like the Strait of Hormuz or the Persian Gulf. Here's the thing. When Ukraine hits a vessel on that specific route, it's not just a Russia-Ukraine war story anymore. It becomes, whether intentionally or not, an action that directly benefits the broader Western-aligned position in the Iran conflict by disrupting one of Iran's suspected external supply channels. Understand that this creates an overlap in objectives between two conflicts that, on paper, have entirely separate causes, entirely separate combatants, and entirely separate international frameworks governing them. Let's talk about why that overlap matters strategically. Because it's not just a curiosity, it has real consequences. When two wars start sharing targets, even indirectly, they start sharing risk. If Iran views this strike as evidence that Ukraine is functioning as a proxy actor advancing Western objectives against Iran specifically, that changes how Iran might calculate its own responses, not just toward Ukraine, but toward the broader coalition of countries it already sees itself in conflict with. In my opinion, as someone who's spent years watching how maritime conflicts escalate and interconnect, this is exactly the kind of development that turns two contained regional conflicts into something with far less predictable boundaries. Now, let's widen the lens further, because this Caspian strike isn't happening in isolation from everything else going on across global shipping right now. At the same time this strike occurred, we've seen traffic through the Strait of Hormuz collapse by roughly 80%, driven by the Iran conflict directly. War risk insurance for vessels transiting that strait has jumped from around 1% of total ship and cargo value up to somewhere between 7.5% and 9%, meaning a single large tanker could be paying up to $10 million just in insurance for one transit. Dark transits, vessels turning off their tracking systems to avoid being seen, now account for roughly 82% of all voyages through that route. Simultaneously, in the Red Sea, Houthi forces have struck two Saudi Arabian tankers and Saudi shore facilities, pushing war risk insurance in that region from around 3% up towards 75% for vessels connected to Saudi business. China has announced it's pulling its very large crude carriers out of that entire region, with both COSCO and China merchants refusing to send tankers back through. And in the Black Sea, Russia struck approximately 28 Ukrainian-linked vessels over the span of a single month, while Ukraine's own Operation Malka has been targeting Russian shuttle tankers moving oil through the Sea of Azov. Understand what you're looking at when you put all of this together. You have three separate maritime conflict zones: the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and the Black Sea, and now the Caspian Sea, all experiencing active naval or quasi-naval conflict at the exact same time. And this Caspian Sea strike is the clearest single data point showing those conflicts aren't staying in their lanes. They're beginning to overlap, both in terms of the actors involved and the strategic objectives being pursued. Let's go back to the historical parallel I think is worth raising carefully here, because I don't want anyone jumping to the wrong conclusion. I am not saying this is the start of a world war, but structurally, what we're watching, separate regional conflicts gradually merging through shared maritime tactics and overlapping strategic interests, echoes a pattern historians point to in the lead up to the Second World War, when disputes over freedom of the seas in different theaters, the Atlantic and the Pacific, eventually became entangled with each other, rather than remaining contained. I teach an entire course on the world wars, and this pattern of separate maritime conflicts gradually reinforcing one another is exactly the kind of structural warning sign that gets flagged in that material. Now, let's talk about the practical consequences of this kind of overlap for global shipping, because that's ultimately what this channel is about. When conflicts stay contained to a single region, insurers, ship owners, and charterers can price risk relatively cleanly. You know which routes are dangerous, you price accordingly, and you route around the problem when you can. But when conflicts start overlapping, that pricing model breaks down. A shipping company operating in the Caspian Sea now has to consider not just the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but the Iran conflict as well, because a strike like this one shows those two wars can reach into the same body of water and the same supply chains. That uncertainty is far more expensive to price than a single, well-understood regional conflict, and it's already showing up in the broader pattern of skyrocketing charter rates and insurance premiums we're seeing across all of these regions simultaneously. Here's my read on this whole situation, and I want to be clear, this is my opinion, based on years spent tracking maritime conflict patterns and vessel movement. This Caspian Sea strike is a bigger deal than its size suggests. A 90-meter cargo ship and a patrol vessel aren't massive assets in the grand scheme of global shipping tonnage, but the location and the timing tell a much bigger story than the vessels themselves. In my opinion, this strike marks the point where the Russia-Ukraine war stopped being purely a Russia-Ukraine war and started functioning as one thread in a much larger interconnected maritime conflict that spans from the Black Sea all the way through the Caspian, down through the Persian Gulf, and out into the Red Sea. And I think that's the real story here, more than the strike itself. We are watching, in real time, the early stages of what could become a genuinely global maritime conflict environment, not because any single actor wants a world war, but because the individual conflicts keep bumping into each other's supply lines, their strategic objectives, and now, quite literally, the same stretches of water. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Given that this strike directly benefited the broader anti-Iran coalition's objectives by disrupting a suspected Russia to Iran supply route, do you think Ukraine deliberately expanded its targeting to support that broader coalition? Or do you think this was simply an opportunistic strike against a legitimate military target that happened to have these larger implications? Let me know where you land on that, and let's get a real debate going in the comments. If you got value out of this breakdown, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next update. Leave a comment, share this with someone who needs to see how these conflicts are actually connecting, and if you want to support the channel directly, hit that super thanks button below, or head over to Patreon. Until the next episode.